Raoul warnt vor einem möglichen Szenario, das an die Jahre 1998-99 erinnert. Seiner Einschätzung nach könnte es passieren, dass plötzlich mehrere große Risiken aus der Welt geschaffen werden, etwa durch ein Abkommen zwischen beispielsweise Saudi-Arabien, den USA, Israel und dem Iran, einen Waffenstillstand in der Ukraine oder vernünftige Schritte Chinas in globalen Konflikten. Und wenn diese Fälle eintreten, würden die gefürchteten Extremrisiken wegfallen. Dann, so Raoul, könnten Anleger trotzdem weiter vor steigender Inflation warnen, selbst wenn die Daten zeigen, dass sie sinkt. Und dieses Narrativ könnte sich 18 Monate halten, ähnlich wie in der Vergangenheit.
Let's assume that Saudi, the US and Israel do a deal with Iran. That feels like it's going to happen. Let's say that there will be a ceasefire in Ukraine, and let's assume that the Chinese will come to the table, do something reasonable. Those three things happen, we've taken all of the left tail off the table. And people are going to be like, oh, but inflation's going to come back. And they're going to keep saying that for 18 months, which they kept saying as inflation's fall. So I think it is not a small probability that we have a really blow-off kind of next 9 months or so.
Sein Fazit: Es sei nicht unwahrscheinlich, dass die Märkte in den nächsten 9 Monaten eine überraschend starke Rallye erleben, eine Art Blow-off-Phase, in der Ängste kurzfristig in den Hintergrund rücken und Optimismus die Kurse antreibt. Die Welt könne dann laut Raoul vor einem massiven Markthöhenflug stehen, einen möglichen Waffenstillstand in der Ukraine, diplomatische Fortschritte zwischen den USA, Saudi-Arabien und Iran oder Chinas Kooperationsbereitschaft könnten zentrale Risiken für die Märkte entschärfen, und bereits 2 dieser Szenarien würden kombiniert mit sinkender Inflation die größten Risiken eliminieren, was laut Raoul einen explosiven Anstieg von Aktien und Krypto auslösen könnte. Einem Blow-off-Top, getrieben von Narrativen, Liquidität und Momentum, nicht Fundamentaldaten. Und wir haben bei Bitcoin ein neues Allzeithoch gesehen. Heimlich ist Liquidität ins System geflossen. Die Mischung aus Skepsis und stiller Geldflut könnte nun zu einer plötzlichen Rallye führen, sobald die Erkenntnis einsetzt, dass Risiken schwinden, und dann könnten wir die von Raoul beschriebene Bananazone sehen. Und lass uns da jetzt mal kurz anschauen, was Raoul gesagt hat. Und wenn du dir durch Krypto finanzielle Freiheit aufbauen willst, klick auf den Link in der Beschreibung unterhalb des Videos. Schau dir das Video an, es ist kostenlos und nur noch für kurze Zeit so verfügbar. Raoul erklärt, dass Kryptowährungen oft falsch eingeschätzt werden. Sie seien kein isoliertes Phänomen, sondern ein makroökonomischer Vermögenswert, der von denselben Faktoren abhänge wie traditionelle Märkte, Liquidität, Konjunkturzyklen und Stimmung. Und seit Jahren beobachtet Raoul wie Bitcoin und andere Kryptowährungen auf globale Geldströme reagieren. Oft extremer in ihren Bewegungen, aber grundsätzlich vorhersehbar. Und aktuell deutet alles auf eine starke Aufwärtsphase hin. Die globale Geldmenge M2, ein Schlüsselindikator für Liquidität, habe sich stabilisiert und steige wieder extrem an. Und historisch gesehen kündigt dies Rallyes bei Risikovermögenswerten wie Bitcoin an, dessen Kursentwicklung aktuell fast parallel zu der Entwicklung zu diesem Trend verlaufe. Gleichzeitig sei die Stimmung, so Raoul in Tech-Aktien und Kryptomärkten trotz steigender Preise extrem pessimistisch, und das ist ein klassisches Kaufsignal, da viele Anleger die Erholung verpassten. Raoul vergleicht die Situation mit der Asienkrise 1997. Damals führte eine kurze, heftige Schockphase zu einer V-förmigen Erholung, als Zentralbanken Liquidität ins System pumpten. Und Ähnliches sehe er heute.
So, what I've done is built that framework of how crypto is just a macro asset. And it took a long time for people to believe that. They thought it's something different, it's something unique. It's a macro asset. So you apply the same things that I've always used, which is liquidity, business cycle, all that stuff, plus a bit of technicals and sentiment. There's no voodoo here. It's pretty straightforward as an asset. It's just more volatile. So it's harder to deal with, but you were right. What I was seeing was like the liquidity indicators like Global M2 had stabilized and started going up. It leads Bitcoin. Bitcoin was following it almost perfectly. So I was starting to look for the bottom. Then I start looking at stuff like, okay, where's sentiment on NASDAQ? Because it's tech stock, same thing. It was in the gutter. Right. Sentiment was the worst I had seen since COVID. That was across the board, across everything. Even hedge fund long short, everybody was max bearish. And I'm looking at liquidity. It's going up. I'm seeing the market getting fearful over a narrative. And I'm like, well, what is the likely outcome here? Are they going to have 150%, a trillion% tariffs on China? No, they're going to reach something normal. So you've gone from peak headline fear to things could only be better from here. So for me, it was like a no-brainer of an opportunity, both in tech stocks and in crypto. And so going forwards now, normally speaking, this is the period. My framework is about them rolling the debt and having to provide liquidity to do so. And so what we've got is a lot of forward-looking liquidity coming out of whether it's the weakness of the dollar, whether it's other countries using their balance sheets, a number of different mechanisms. And all of that to me is suggesting that the rest of this year is going to be very strong. And I was kind of thinking the NASDAQ was going to be a V-shaped recovery. And my God, it was a V-shaped recovery. And people are still underweight and short. I mean, it's a hell of a setup. We overlaid the chart of 1997, the Asian crisis, was a short, sharp shock, versus now it's almost identical. The 4-month period leading up to it, 4 or 5 months leading up to it. And that was a V-shaped recovery as well, because everybody was caught off sides because they thought the world was going to end. Liquidity came into the system. It was via the Fed that time cutting rates and all the other central banks. And the market just went up in a straight line for the next 2 years.
Geopolitische Risiken wie Konflikte in der Ukraine oder Spannungen mit China könnten sich entschärfen, was die größten Befürchtungen der Märkte zerstreue. Selbst ohne Zinssenkungen der US-Notenbank reiche bereits die Aussicht, dass die Straffung der Geldpolitik endet, um Risikovermögenswerte wie Tech-Aktien und Krypto zu befeuern. Institutionelle Anleger spielten hier ebenfalls eine zentrale Rolle. Staatliche Fonds aus dem Nahen Osten investierten bereits massiv, angezogen von der zunehmend regulatorischen Klarheit in den USA. Großbanken wie Goldman Sachs oder JP Morgan warteten nur auf grünes Licht, um ihre Kryptoangebote auszuweiten. Raoul sieht Parallelen zur Einführung von Gold-ETFs oder Rohstoffindizes. Zuerst skeptisch, wurden diese später Standard in Portfolios. Krypto durchlaufe gerade dieselbe Akzeptanzphase, volatil, aber unaufhaltsam.
There is a risk here that we rerun 98, 99 or 99 because you've just taken all the tail risk. Let's assume that Saudi, the US, and Israel do a deal with Iran. That feels like it's going to happen. Let's say that there will be a ceasefire in Ukraine, and let's assume that the Chinese will come to the table, do something reasonable. Those 3 things happen, we've taken all of the left tail off the table. And people are going to be like, oh, but inflation's going to come back. And they're going to keep saying that for 18 months, which they kept saying as inflation's fall. So I think it is not a small probability that we have a really blow off kind of next 9 months or so. The last Trump cycle in 2017, where the same thing, the market corrected in the beginning because everyone's fearing tariffs and the same narrative. The Fed were raising rates and doing the balance sheet runoff. And the market screamed higher all year because the Chinese were stimulating, the Europeans had to stimulate. So it feels like, even if the Fed don't do anything, I still think the Fed cut, but let's assume they don't. Well, that's not a prerequisite for the market to do anything. As you said, as long as rates aren't jacking higher, everything's fine.
While mainstream narratives remain fixated on inflation risks and geopolitical instability, Raoul offers a sharply contrasting view, grounded in macroeconomic indicators and capital flows. He argues that crypto, often misunderstood as an isolated asset class, is in fact deeply tied to the same forces that drive global equity markets: liquidity, sentiment, and the business cycle. When those levers move, crypto reacts, often with greater volatility, but also greater upside. According to the liquidity backdrop has already begun shifting. Global M2, a broad measure of money supply, has stabilized and turned higher. Historically, this has been a leading indicator for Bitcoin and risk assets, and once again, Bitcoin's price action appears to be closely following that trend. Simultaneously, sentiment in tech and equity markets has remained deeply bearish, even as asset prices recover, creating a powerful contrarian setup. Hedge funds, institutional portfolios, and retail traders alike have remained underexposed, missing the rally in both crypto and US equities. The result is what describes as a no-brainer opportunity. With forward-looking liquidity quietly increasing, fueled by a combination of dollar weakness, central bank interventions abroad, and ongoing debt rollovers, markets are positioned for continued upside. He compares the current environment to the post-Asian financial crisis recovery in 1998 to 1999, where a V-shaped rebound caught investors off guard, launching a 2-year bull run driven by surprise central bank easing and improved global coordination. Crucially, Powell emphasizes that the current rally isn't predicated on the Federal Reserve cutting rates, although that remains a likely tailwind. Instead, it's the absence of further tightening and the dissipation of macro fears that's allowing risk assets to reprice aggressively higher. From his vantage point, we are only in the early innings of a full-scale restocking of U.S. equities and crypto allocations, a process that could last well into next year, especially if geopolitical risks resolve and inflation fears continue to fade.
No, it's real. And I'll tell you why it's real. I've just come back from the Middle East. All of the sovereign wealth funds are now buying, right? These are the largest pools of capital in the world. We're hearing it out of Saudi, out of Abu Dhabi, out of Qatar, and out of Bahrain. And why that's happening is because the US has become crypto friendly. It's the green light. So the US will get some regulation through. There'll be a bit of a shit show and debating about it and the usual stuff, but they will get some regulation through, which is the clarity that all of the pension funds need. So they're waiting as well. So there is a lot of buying to come from the really big players who've been waiting. Like Goldman has not been able to fully build out its desk, and JP Morgan haven't. They've had crypto for a while, but only for certain types of customers. But they want to build out suites of product, but they've been waiting for regulatory clarity. So, yeah, I think it's a big deal. Like, the institutions are still either trying to figure out what this thing is. Yeah. Right? I had a conversation with one of the biggest kind of financial asset management firms in the world yesterday, based out of the US. And they're like, they've even got a crypto division, but they're other kind of where they allocate the assets. They're like, we don't know how to deal with this. So they're still trying to figure out what it is. Yeah. Like, they haven't figured out it's a macro asset. Others have. The sovereign wealth funds obviously are just doing it for diversification of reserves. They're like, it's a technology, it's a diversification of reserves. So if the US is going to do it, we're going to do it. So there's different groups doing different stuff. There is a bunch of people who still don't really want to do the homework on it. They're like, we don't know, it's too volatile for us. But I think usually it's the first mover advantage in this. And, you know, again, it reminds me a lot of back in the day when Goldman rolled out the GSCI index and nobody had commodities in their portfolios, and that team had to go around and sell commodities to everybody. And they would say, the clients would say, but it's too volatile. And you say, yes, but part of a diversified portfolio, it's exactly the same thing, right?
That's right.
It's exactly. And also, you know, we were around when the gold ETF started, and it's the same thing. Everyone was like, holy shit, where did this come from? It became a very, very big ETF. It's exactly the same. You know, what people like to do, because there's so many new participants in the industry, they think it's all new and different. When you've been around as long as you and I, you realize nothing is different. We've gone through all of this before. This just happens to be a bigger, faster moving asset, but it's the same as GSCI was. It's the same as the gold ETF was. You know, it's the same as the NASDAQ was when we didn't understand what the it was and why it went up all the time. It's all of these things combined, right?
What do you think about gold here, Raoul?
So I came up with something, it was only last month in Global Macro Investor that kind of shocked me, hadn't figured out, is that there is a set of dominoes that happen in markets. Financial conditions lead everything. For financial conditions, we use the dollar, rates, and oil, right? The three big financial conditions thing. What we found is that leads like the ISM and other stuff by about 9 months. And it leads liquidity by about 6 months, something like that. Liquidity is what drives Bitcoin and NASDAQ, and it leads it by 3 months. So global M2, let's say, leads Bitcoin by about 3 months. I found out, I was like, what's going on with gold? I put it against against financial conditions. It reacts in real time to financial conditions.
Auch Gold analysiert Raoul neu. Der Preis reagiere nicht auf ferne Krisenszenarien, sondern unmittelbar auf Finanzierungsbedingungen. Sinke der Dollarwert oder lockere die Geldpolitik, steige Gold sofort, ein direktes Signal für Währungsentwertung. Und diese Muster zeigten, dass alle Vermögenswerte letztlich makroökonomischen Regeln folgten. Für Raoul ist also klar, die Kombination aus steigender Liquidität, unterinvestierten Institutionen und nachlassenden Risikoängsten schaffe schaffe explosive Voraussetzungen. Das heißt also, die nächsten Monate könnten eine Rallye auslösen, die viele überraschen wird, ähnlich wie 2017, als Märkte trotz Zinserhöhungen explodierten, einfach weil das große Geld noch nicht im Spiel war. Raoul Pal skizziert eine mögliche Zeitenwende an den Finanzmärkten. Ein Umbruch, der an vergangene Revolutionen erinnert, aber dieses Mal in rasantem Tempo abläuft. Seine Analyse zeigt, wie große Kapitalmächte wie Staatsfonds aus dem Nahen Osten, US-Pensionskassen oder Großbanken heimlich Positionen in Krypto und auch in Bitcoin und Aktien aufbauen. Und der entscheidende Unterschied zu früher, nicht die Technologie hat sich geändert, sondern die Regulierung. Klare Signale aus den USA geben institutionellen Investoren jetzt die Sicherheit, um in großem Stil einzusteigen. Trotzdem zögern viele Vermögensverwalter noch. Manche verstehen Krypto nicht, andere scheuen die Volatilität oder wissen nicht, wie sie es in klassische Portfolios einordnen sollen. Raoul Pal vergleicht die Situation mit historischen Marktumbrüchen wie der Einführung des Rohstoffindex GSCI oder des Gold-ETFs. Jedes Mal bremste anfängliche Unsicherheit die Masse, während mutige Vorreiter profitierten. Und seine These stützt sich auf Daten, Finanzbedingungen wie der US-Dollar, Ölpreise und Zinsen steuern makroökonomische Trends. Darauf folgen Liquiditätsschübe, die schließlich Risikoassets wie Bitcoin antreiben. Und interessant ist, dass die globale Liquidität von Bitcoin etwa 3 Monate hinterherhinkt, während Gold sofort reagiert. Der Grund: Gold spiegelt direkte Angst vor Währungsentwertung wider, während Krypto stärker von systemischen Liquiditätsströmen abhängt. Gleichzeitig treiben Rekorddefizite, manipulierte Märkte und komplexe Geldpolitik strukturelle Veränderungen voran. Kein kurzfristiger Hype, sondern ein fundamentales Umdenken. Und die Frage ist also nicht, ob ein neuer Bullenzyklus kommt, sondern nur noch, wann wirklich diese Bananenzone kommt. Die Rahmenbedingungen stehen günstig, Liquidität steigt, Stimmungen sind vorsichtig optimistisch und viele Investoren sind noch unterinvestiert oder schauen von der Seitenlinie zu. Wie in der Vergangenheit könnten also diese Kombinationen laut Raoul Pal schnell Kursbewegungen auslösen, noch bevor die breite Masse reagiert. Während Institutionen im Hintergrund bereits leise die Weichen stellen, bleibt Privatanlegern also wenig Zeit, um den Anschluss nicht zu verpassen.